A few weeks ago, Mr. Soros asked me, as a preparation for this, the job I'm doing at the moment, to research the intellectual antecedents, if any, of the notion of reflexivity, which he has thought about for so many years and is explaining to you today. So I said, okay, I can do that. So my first recourse was to go to Wikipedia, the well-known resource, and I typed in self-fulfilling prophecy first, and the page came up and I started to read it, and the first thing that's noted in that entry was that a man called Robert K. Merton, a sociologist, invented the phrase self-fulfilling prophecy, which apparently derives from the Thomas theorem, which states that, quote, if men define situations as real, they are real in their consequences. So reading through this entry, first of all, I came across a quote from Robert Merton himself, and he was discussing the case of a bank run caused by a crisis of confidence in the solvency of the bank. So Merton concludes the example by saying, quote, the parable tells us that public definitions of a situation, prophecies or predictions, become an integral part of the situation and thus affect subsequent developments. This is peculiar to human affairs. It is not found in the world of nature, untouched by human hands. Predictions of the return of Halley's comet do not influence its orbit. But the rumored insolvency of Millingville's bank did affect the actual outcome. The prophecy of collapse led to its own fulfillment. So that's Merton's explanation of his concept of a self-fulfilling prophecy. As I read through, very soon we have a quote preceded by philosopher Karl Popper called the self-fulfilling prophecy the Oedipus effect. This is a quote from Popper's autobiography, Unending Quest. He says, one of the ideas I discussed in The Poverty of Historicism was the influence of a prediction upon the event predicted. I had called this the Oedipus effect because the oracle played a most important role in the sequence of events which led to the fulfillment of its prophecy. For a time, I thought that the existence of the Oedipus effect distinguished the social from the natural sciences. That's to say, the influence of a prediction upon the event predicted. But in biology too, he goes on, even in molecular biology, expectations often play a role in bringing about what has been expected. He doesn't actually explain why he thinks that in molecular biology, and on the face of it, it sounds implausible. In any case, that's what he says. So having read Wikipedia, then I had a look at The Poverty of Historicism. I obtained the book and looked up the Oedipus effect in the index. So I'm going to read you a few passages from the crucial 4 or 5 pages, so you all have an idea. The point is so as to lay Mr. Soros's idea of reflexivity out in somebody else's words, and then I'm going to invite him to comment on how he sees the notion which he's developed in relation to these earlier ideas, or what sound to be similar ideas. I must say I was quite struck by Popper's formulation of the idea. So here's what Popper says in The Poverty of Historicism, which I think came out sometime in the 1940s, so quite a long time ago, and Robert Merton was writing around the same time. So page 11, under the heading, Inexactitude of Prediction. The idea that a prediction may have influence upon the predicted event is a very old one. Oedipus in the legend killed his father, whom he had never seen before, and this was the direct result of the prophecy which had caused his father to abandon him. This is why I suggest the name Oedipus effect for the influence of the prediction upon the predicted event, or more generally, for the influence of an item of information upon the situation to which the information refers, whether this influence tends to bring about the predicted event or whether it tends to prevent it. He calls it the Oedipus effect. I think it might be more aptly called the Macbeth effect, because, of course, as you remember in that play, the witch's prediction of Macbeth's murder of the king is partly, at least, what brings about the murder of the king and many other things that happen in that story. So we have a case of the prediction influencing the course of events. So that's the first formulation. A little bit further, on page 12, he says, it's under the heading Objectivity and Valuation. We are faced in the social sciences with a full and complicated interaction between observer and observed, between subject and object. The awareness of the existence of tendencies which might produce a future event, and furthermore, the awareness that the prediction might itself exert an influence on events predicted, is likely to have repercussions on the content of the prediction. And the repercussions might be of such a kind as gravely to impair the objectivity of the predictions and of other results of research in the social sciences. A prediction is a social happening which may interact with other social happenings, and among them with the one which it predicts. It may, as we have seen, help to precipitate this event, but it's easy to see that it may also influence it in other ways. It may, in an extreme case, even cause the happening it predicts. The happening might not have occurred at all if it had not been predicted. At the other extreme, the prediction of an impending event may lead to its prevention, so that by deliberately or negligently abstaining from predicting it, the social scientist, it may be said, could bring it about or could cause it to happen. There will clearly be many intermediate cases between these two extremes. The action of predicting something and that of abstaining from prediction might both have all sorts of consequences. A final brief quote. The interaction between pronouncements and social life almost invariably creates situations in which we have not only to consider the truth of such pronouncements, but also their actual influence on future developments. The social scientist may be striving to find the truth, but at the same time, he must always be exerting a definite influence upon society. The very fact that his pronouncements do exert an influence destroys their objectivity. So these ideas certainly sound very much in the same ballpark, as we say, as Mr. Soros's ideas. So the first thing I'll do before we turn to questions from the audience is invite Mr. Soros to comment on this and how he sees the concept of reflexivity that he's explained today in relation to these earlier ideas.
Yes. First of all, I think Popper spoke mainly the reflexivity of social theories, whereas I emphasize the reflexivity of the subject matter. I recognize, of course, also the reflexivity of social theories, but more important is that the participants are engaged in reflexive phenomena. Of course, sociology has recognized reflexivity as a social phenomenon, and Merton was definitely the pathbreaker with the bandwagon effect and the self-fulfilling prophecies. But economics has gone out of its way to eliminate reflexivity from the subject matter, and we have paid a very heavy price, amounting to trillions of dollars for that little mistake. So that's, I would say, is the difference. The other thing that I would point out, that this reflexivity as a phenomenon hasn't been analyzed the way, for instance, self-reference with Bertrand Russell and Frege and so on. And I got onto reflexivity by reading about self-reference and the paradox of the liar. That's what led me on. But then I discovered that it is really a much more pervasive phenomenon. So I would say those are the major differences. And you know, I then broke down reflexivity into the cognitive and manipulative functions, and argued that the two functions interfere with each other, creating an element of uncertainty, which is a characteristic of human affairs. Of course, it's not the only one, and when it comes to uncertainty, again, economic theory has gone overboard trying to eliminate uncertainty, but there are, of course, very valuable antecedents. I would quote particularly Knightian uncertainty, which is basically what I'm harping on also.
I mean, one thing you didn't mention there, but worth mentioning, I think, is neither Popper nor Merton saw the application of reflexivity to the behavior of financial markets. And since you were a participant in financial markets, you applied it to that area, yes. And where it, of course, applies spectacularly well, right. In that area, which enabled you to understand economic notions.
And the particular irony is that Robert Merton's son got a Nobel Prize for devising a formula which ignored reflexivity.
Okay, I'm now, my job is to throw the floor open to our audience, and we're supposed to take questions first from the remote audience at the London School of Economics. We're supposed to take 3 questions from them before we move to people here. And let me say before getting questions from the LSE that I would implore questioners to, first of all, identify themselves by name and affiliation, then to make their questions concise and to speak as clearly as possible, because we're hearing from here, and to make their questions, not speeches. So a question to Mr. Soros, concisely stated and clearly articulated, would be greatly appreciated. With that, I open the floor to the LSE. Now we wait for the moderator in London to
Hello from London. Hello, can you hear us or
yes.
see us? Hello, George. We've very much enjoyed your lecture, and we have actually 3, I hope 4 questions, if we can fit it in 10 minutes. So I'm going to hand it over to the first person.
Hello, my name is Zachary Mizell.
We need more volume.
I'm a master's student in international political economy here at the LSE. I was interested in how a third party could become aware of a reflexive relationship and how they could sort of interact in order to gain from the information they learn about the existence of that relationship. And an applied example of that or applied question would be, how would a government become aware of a positive reflexive relationship and intervene in financial markets in order to dampen the boom-bust cycle that results as a consequence of reflexivity?
Okay. I have some, unfortunately, difficulty hearing.
I did too.
Mary, perhaps you could just repeat the question, because I have difficulty hearing it.
I couldn't hear it.
Yeah. Could you repeat the question?
What he was interested in was the role of the third party in a reflexive relationship, and in particular, the role of a government. Could the government identify a reflexive participation, a reflexive relationship, in fact be reflexive itself, in order to dampen down boom-bust cycles? Did you hear that?
Can you?
Can you hear me?
Only just, not enough.
I'm making it simpler and simpler. He put it very well. How can a third party influence a two-party reflexive relationship? And how can a government intervene using your theory to stop a boom-bust cycle? Did you hear that?
How can the government intervene? Well, of course, this question leads up to tomorrow's lecture. That's exactly what I will discuss tomorrow. But let me just preface it, perhaps, by saying that regulators and government and financial authorities also are subject to the same limits of fallibility as market participants. So you have a constant interplay between regulators and market participants, but both sides operate with imperfect understanding. And that's what makes the process so interesting. But I will deal with that more tomorrow.
Unfortunately, we're not going to hear you tomorrow, but perhaps you can tell us when you next come to LSE. I'm handing over to the next question.
Hi, thank you for sharing your insights today. My name is Jawad Karadia, and I am a part-time finance student at master's and a full-time proprietary trader. And my question to you is if you could talk a little bit about how your general theory relates to trend following and charting in general, and how much you may have or may not have used these sorts of strategies in your own trading. Thank you.
Well, again, obviously, being at the London School of Economics, we are particularly interested in financial markets, and that's again trend following. I could answer in general terms that actually trends tend to validate themselves for an extended period, and therefore trend following is very often a valid strategy which contradicts, let's say, the prevailing paradigm of efficient market and rational expectations. However, reality may not fulfill the expectations that are involved in that trend, and then you reach a point where the trend is reversed, and you don't want to be a trend follower at that time.
Third question.
Hi, I'm Purna Harjani, and I'm an undergraduate student studying social policy. My question to you is, how do you feel about the fact that Adam Smith is known to be the father of economics for his theories on the invisible hand, when market fundamentalism is an economic policy you criticize the most? Thank you.
Again, I didn't understand the question. Did you?
I think the question was, how do you feel about Adam Smith as the father of economics and the inventor of the invisible hand in light of your theory of reflexivity?
Well, you know, Adam Smith wrote 2 books. I haven't read either of them. And I am critical of the invisible hand, actually. Markets actually perform a very valuable function, but they only are designed to allow individuals to fulfill their individual needs. And there are social issues, like, for instance, the regulation of markets, that markets are not designed to solve or to deal with. So behind the invisible hand of the market, there is hidden the visible hand of politics. And that visible hand is deliberately obscured by market fundamentalists who extol the virtues of the markets, forgetting or obfuscating the fact that behind the market mechanism there are political decisions that are then determining how markets function. I will, again, you are anticipating, actually this happens to be the 4th lecture, where I will talk about market values and social values and the conflict between capitalism and open society. But I'm happy to anticipate that subject.
I'm surprised that nobody from the LSE wants to ask a question of Mr. Soros about Popper's philosophy versus his philosophy, because after all, this is where Karl Popper was a professor, but there are no questions about the philosophical content of what Mr. Soros said in relation to Popper. But maybe later we can come back to LSE, but I think now we'll throw the questions open to the audience present before us. So anybody with hands up, and then we proceed. Yes. I think you need to get a microphone from somebody, unless, I don't know, unless you can speak loudly.
I would like to know what's the effect, the role of an educated society as in the reflexivity effect. For one side, a high educated society, each person has a bigger effect. But another side, an educated society is more rational, and perhaps a more rational society, the reflexivity effect is more. Anyway, what's the role of education of a society to have a bigger or a smaller effect?
Well, Christopher Buarque is from Brazil, and he was Minister of Education, and he introduced Bolsa Escola, which is actually a payment to poor families to allow their children to attend school. And I think it's a wonderful scheme, and has made a big difference in Brazil, and it has been imitated in other countries, notably Mexico. And I'm actually a great supporter of that scheme. We introduced a variant of it in New York, about which I am not so entirely happy, but I'm supporting it also. And obviously, education is most important for an open society. And altogether, I think that if people, citizens, would understand the limitations of our ability to deal with social problems, if they understood reflexivity, actually we could deal with our social problems better. So most of my philosophy has a kind of a negative tinge or to it, namely imperfect understanding and fallibility. These all sound very bad, but in effect, if you understand it and you are in a better position to improve your policies. Perfection can be the bane of social reform. In the French Revolution, people believing in reason engaged in terror. The various ideologies which claim to be in possession of the ultimate truth could be only imposed by force. So I think if we understand our limitations and we turn it around, and what is imperfect can be improved. So we are in a way fortunate that with our fallibility, because that leaves infinite scope for improvement. We won't solve all our problems. We'll leave some for the next generations to come.
So education should teach uncertainty rather than dogma.
Right. And I've been arguing also that we ought to pass from the age of reason to the age of fallibility, that it's let's say, an achievement of reason to understand fallibility.
Okay, who's next? Yes, gentleman in the middle there.
Hello, I am Roberto Rogel. I'm from Mexico. I studied MBA business school.
Better wait for it, yeah.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Roberto Rogel from Mexico. I studied MBA in the CU Business School. My question is, well, it's been said that the 20th century was the physics century, and while this century will be the biology century.
Will be?
The biology. Century.
Biology.
And there is a hypothesis that telling us that all the sciences will come closer together. Do you think this threatens your own hypothesis or your own proposal that we should separate the social sciences from the natural sciences?
Well, I think his question is, if you didn't say much about biology, you did allude to it at one point, because you have the separation between the social sciences and the natural sciences. He's bringing up the point that biology is becoming central, and so he's wondering whether biology threatens the dichotomy that you have, because it seems to involve, say, study of the social insects, for example.
Right.
That kind of issue. I think that's what he was.
Yeah. No, actually, one of the questions that I struggle with is how does reflexivity relate to complexity? Because, let's say, evolutionary systems theory has great similarities with reflexivity in the sense that it does not have a determinate outcome, and it evolves. And I think that the two are in a way quite close to each other, in the sense that evolutionary systems theory, network theory has relevance to human society, which is also a kind of network. So let's say general rules about network theory apply actually to financial markets, to banks, because banks were networks, and you had contagion destroying the financial system, similar to a viral attack. So let's say epidemiology has a relevance, and which we ignored, and which people are now aware of, and we are now looking at those issues. So there are things to be learned from biology and other networks. However, I think reflexivity, which has to do with the specific relationship between thinking and reality, that's a specifically human characteristic. In other words, it applies to human societies. It may apply to whales, because whales seem to be able to communicate, and there are some evidence that actually pretty elaborate societies. So I don't want to delimit it purely to human society. But even there, we probably is more relevant. The content of our thinking is probably more relevant to our problems than the thinking of whales is to our problems. So that's why I think reflexivity throws light on the human condition. And that's how I see the two relate to each other.
And presumably our primate ancestors will have reflexive relations, won't they? One of them thinks another is about to take over their place as the alpha
look,
male.
If I described marriage as a reflexive relationship, then certainly monkeys would qualify for.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much. My name is Fernando Schmidt. I am the ambassador of Chile. I see a lot of South American people here. Well, my question is very simple. Can you elaborate a little bit more on reflexivity and emotions?
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly, first of all, reason and emotion are inescapably connected. That's one of the discoveries of brain science, which confirms Hume's contention. So this concept of the disembodied intellect was I think it's currently superseded. But it isn't purely emotion that kind of interferes with reason. There are rational problems in reflexive situations. So, for instance, because of this false dichotomy between reason and emotion and this concept of disembodied intellect and rational behavior, Alan Greenspan described bubbles, specifically the IT bubble, the technology bubble, as irrational exuberance, these famous words that he applied in 1996. Well, it misdescribes bubbles, because if I, as a market participant, see a bubble coming, I buy, because that's the profitable thing, the rational thing to do. And that creates bubbles. So you can't rely on markets to prevent asset bubbles from forming. And therefore, he was wrong to describe it as irrational. And in effect, you can't count on rational behavior preventing bubbles. So that's a problem that needs to be solved, and actually requires the regulators to accept responsibility for preventing asset bubbles from growing too large. So a misinterpretation of what bubbles are or how financial markets operate lead to the wrong policies.
So emotions may be involved in reflexive situations,
but
not necessarily.
It's not emotion. It's not because it's fear and greed. Right. It's in the nature, as I will try to explain tomorrow, why and how. It is in the nature of financial markets that they are bubble prone, not equilibrium bound.
Okay, who's next? Gentleman in the front row. Oh.
I'm a CU student and I'm interested.
We'll have you next.
What is the secret of your financial success in reflect of your family story? Thank you.
I can't hear.
I didn't hear that.
Sorry.
Can I repeat?
Would you like to come up and maybe can you?
Say it again.
What is the secret of your financial success in reflect of your family story? Thank you.
I would say that recognizing that I may be wrong. As simple as that.
Shall we move to the gentleman here? Yes.
George,
delighted to see you here.
Should I conclude from what you said there are no lessons from history.
Hang on, hang on.
Do I speak into this? Should we conclude that there are no real lessons from history, but only subjective interpretations?
No, I don't know how you reach that conclusion from what I said.
Because it cannot be tested.
Well, but I was arguing that the methods of natural science, as described so elegantly by Popper, do not apply to the study of history. It doesn't mean that we cannot study history, that we cannot learn lessons, that we can't make reasonable, contingent predictions, but not by the methods which produce timelessly valid, universally valid laws. History is one-directional. It's not timeless, it's time-bound. And when you start with that, then you need different methods for studying historical processes. And I will argue in subsequent lectures that economic theory as such takes the wrong approach because it looks for these universally valid laws like you have in physics, whereas you really need to study markets in financial markets and financial processes in a context. And you have to recognize that conditions change and actually don't repeat themselves.
Lady in the middle there. I need to go wait for the microphone.
My name is Katalin Farkas, and I'm a professor of philosophy here at the Central European University. And my question is related exactly to this last point that you made, because you emphasized that Popper's theory of falsification was an explanation of how science can be both empirical and rational, because we have the universal laws, we create a test situation, and if there is a falsifying instance, we give up the law. And on the basis of what you said, we cannot apply the same apparatus in the social sciences because we cannot aim to have universal laws. So I was wondering, how do you think we can hold up social sciences to the requirement of being rational and empirical?
You see, I think that social science can produce universally valid laws, but those laws don't determine the course of events. So, for instance, I think I put forward the human uncertainty principle as a universally valid hypothesis. And I believe it is actually universally valid. But by its very nature, it doesn't determine, it cannot determine how markets, let's say financial markets or history is going to evolve.
In other words, human behavior is unpredictable, and that's a law.
Yes, yes.
Yes.
But there are actually some, for instance, statistical generalizations. I mean, I will distinguish between near equilibrium conditions and far from equilibrium conditions. And it is in the nature of near equilibrium conditions that you can make statistical generalizations, and you can calculate risk on that basis. However, in far from equilibrium conditions, that particular method is going to land you in difficulties, because those things that apply in near equilibrium don't apply in far from equilibrium conditions. That's another generalization.
Here is the question from this side.
Need a microphone over here.
Yeah. No, that's okay. There's somebody.
Yeah, Julius Horvath, Economics Department, CEU. First question, Mr. Soros, is your opinion or understanding of Popper changing as time goes by? Are you more critical or more supportive now, as you were, let's say, in the 50s you mentioned during your student years? And second question is that...
let me answer that,
yeah.
Because I forget. I would say that my opinion of Popper is evolving. I have become more critical of him as time went on, and of course he's not around to defend himself, which is but also actually in preparing these lectures, I went a little too far in criticizing Popper, and then I had to revise it because he actually, for instance, did recognize reflexivity. He only applied it to social sciences, but if pressed, he would certainly agree that it also applies, even with greater force, to participants. But as you will hear in the subsequent lectures, he took it for granted that the purpose of thinking, of discourse, is to get closer to the truth. And that's a false assumption. It's what I call the Enlightenment fallacy. And of course, he was a critic of many of the excessive claims for reason, and nevertheless, he and me too fell into that trap. And it has forced me to modify my concept of open society, which I had adopted from him. Please, the second question.
Oh, we understand that your critical position towards the mainstream, which basically rules maybe from the late 70s or this time period. But the question would be, if it is relevant, which economic school you feel close to? Because there is a huge number of schools, not only what you call there's this fundamentalist, market fundamentalism. You feel closer to Schumpeter, Hayek, Keynes, Frank Knight you mentioned. Thank you.
No, I was definitely very much influenced by Keynes. And I think that, of course, he lived at a particular moment in history where he had to deal with the incipient, or with the problems of depression, and therefore he neglected the problems of inflation. But had he lived at a different time, I'm sure that he would have been also, his analysis would have extended also to analysis of inflation. Because of that, he became discredited in the 70s when inflation was the dominant problem of the time. So I would say that I would consider myself a follower of Keynes. In the same way as I'm a follower of Popper without necessarily agreeing with everything they said.
Let me add to what you were saying in reply to the first question there. Of course, Popper's name for reflexivity, the Oedipus effect, already tells you he would have agreed that it can occur between individuals because that was one prediction about a particular man's future action. It wasn't a social science theory influencing things. So he obviously would have agreed with the general notion, I think, that you were discussing. He doesn't, I think if he was going to give a name to it, I think he would have called it interactivity, not reflexivity. I think an element that you've emphasized that he doesn't emphasize is the positive feedback aspect. He doesn't ever make the point there that I make the prediction of the event, I change the event that I predict, and then that must change the way I see the world. He doesn't see that circular causation that you emphasize. That's the thing. He doesn't pick up, I think, on that point.
Yeah.
Who's next? I can't see everybody so clearly. Here, so yes, you first. Yes. Microphone's coming from
I'm Roman Friedman, professor of economics at New York University. I have a couple of questions. I'll limit myself to two. The first one is that I think what gives I just want your comment on it. You emphasize reflexivity, and there's a certain tension in your writing and even in this speech about the status of fallibility. I wanted to ask you whether fallibility in your mind is necessary for reflexivity to have the force.
Fallibility.
Fallibility being absolutely central. And I wanted to, the chairman, so to speak, had clearly indicated no speeches. I will give no speech. I just want to signal what I mean is that if there was a mechanical connection between reality and thinking and back to reality, that's reflexive, that's certainly would not be something that would yield to the kind of conclusions that you draw in the real world context. And that's where reflexivity is actually quite different from Popper, from Merton. It's very different than the self-fulfilling prophecy that has a vague notion, but does suggest such a mechanical connection. So that's the first point I want to give you a comment on. The second question that is directly, in my mind, related to this, which was asked actually a phenomenal question about educational reflexivity by the gentleman from Brazil, because that question suggests one wonders whether it is complexity that underpins reflexivity. My conjecture here, I have some thoughts on that, is that it is exactly the way Colin just said at the very end. It is change. And it's actually a non-routine change that is crucial for reflexivity to have this force. And you can, yes, when you have education, as Keynes said, we can do more in understanding things, but at some point we're going to reach the limit for it, because there is a question of non-routine change that will always prevent a complete understanding. And therefore, reflexivity is a property of social systems to me, and fallibility that are properties in principle. These are not properties that could be eliminated with time. They can only be eliminated if change in the world ceased, which of course you have understood in your understanding of the social systems, closed versus open. That's why reflexivity to me, so that this is basically a set of issues. Is reflexivity really related to complexity rather than change? And things that relate around this.
Yeah. First of all, of course, fallibility is absolutely essential. It's a universal human condition. And the reflexivity is a two-way connection between biased or misconceptions and, let's say, the objective reality. And there are ways in which misconceptions can actually change the objective conditions. That's reflexivity. But in order to have reflexivity, you must have the misconceptions or the bias view to start with. Otherwise, you wouldn't have the two-way connection. So it replaces this strange concoction of perfect knowledge that is characteristic of the prevailing dogma in economics. So that's...
You didn't say anything about the relation between reflexivity and complexity, yeah, which Roman was asking about.
Well, you see, this is an issue that, as I say, I only have a tentative answer at the moment. Actually, reflexivity doesn't need to be complex, you see, and therefore you can't say that it's the same thing, because actually reflexivity can be something very, very simple, like an enmity between people where one person says to the other, "You are my enemy," and lo and behold, he is your enemy. That's not complex.
I think what underlies reflexivity is awareness, that I can be aware of your attitudes towards me and that can change myself. But of course, when you're looking at the natural world, it's not aware of your attitudes or predictions about it, Halley's Comet or the motions of the planets. So they can't be influenced by our beliefs about them. But as humans, we can be aware of other people's beliefs about us as they express them in statements, and then that can change us as a result of it. I think so. That I think is what reflexivity comes from: consciousness, awareness of others.
Yes.
Who's
and
next?
there's one other point with regard to education. You see, while education is a wonderful thing, it doesn't necessarily give you very good results because reality can be manipulated, and if you are good at manipulating reality, you can get better results. But how you manipulate, what your objectives are, depend on your values. And values are particularly, how shall I say, questionable. In other words, there is no one set of values that you can say, that's good. We have done a lot as a foundation in the way of education. And sometimes we have educated very clever manipulators of public opinion who then used it for very different purposes for which I would have liked them to use it.
There was a lady in the third row there, yes.
As Margaret de Heinrich. And the one word that keeps popping up in my mind from the very beginning of your talk is instinct. And Professor, it's what you were talking about, alluding to awareness, and of course that's the same thing. And you're someone, Mr. Soros, who's been enormously successful. And I imagine in some part because of your natural instinct. And the question is, if you're sharing the concept of reflexivity with so many people, if they don't possess that natural God-given gift of instinct, how can they truly take reflexivity and use it to its full power?
I don't get the question, do you?
Well, I think the question is, you have this conceptual idea of reflexivity which you've applied in your business life, and could other people have had the same success just by taking over the idea, or was it more to do with other factors about you than just having that theory? Yeah. I think that was the form of the question.
Is that the question? Yeah. Well,
I mean, we all have the theory now. We're not all successful.
Yeah. Well, look, it's obviously it's not sufficient. I mean, it's been useful, but it didn't determine the outcome. But the fact is that at the time when I first started using those ideas, they did give me a leg up in the financial markets, because people were, most other players in the market were guided by other ideas. So, however, people did read my book. So I've lost that edge that I had.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it enables you to predict bubbles more easily. It enables you to predict bubbles more easily.
Well, you know, there's a saying that economists have predicted 8 of the last 3 recessions. Well, I predicted 8 of the next 3 bubbles.
What about Howard Robinson in there in the front? He needs a microphone, I think. Is there a microphone nearby? No, okay. This will be a philosophical question, I'm sure.
I was going to say,
I'm glad
this will be a straight philosophical question, I'm afraid. What do you think the connection of your doctrine of reflexivity is to this old-fashioned chestnut of free will? does it follow from what you said that there could not be a deterministic account of human behavior because in some sense or other there are no definite facts about human psychology or what people are going to do? These are not the kind of things that can be put into natural laws, and therefore determinism must be false and good old libertarian free will must be right. Or don't you want to go down that road?
Well, we had a very interesting discussion last night about determinism and free will, and I would take the position that both are half right. And if you put them together, you actually get the reality. To think of free will as being absolutely free is, to me, even more distorted than to claim that human affairs are determined by universally valid laws. I mean, there are, of course, not all of reality can be manipulated. There are the laws of physics that prevail. So you may be extremely good at turning reality, manipulating reality. But in the end, reality has the last word. And you're going to be dead. Now, that's something, for instance, you cannot manipulate away, even though we have developed all kinds of myths to deal with this rather unpalatable prospect.
Well, there are no deterministic laws of psychology itself, I suppose.
Well, I mean, I would say that Freud identified maybe certain people who are sick in the sense that their actions are determined by their idée fixe, their preconceived ideas. But a well-functioning human being has to be influenced by reality.
Yes, I mean, I think your position is that the world is half determined and the will is half free. The world is half determined and the human will is half free.
Well, okay.
As you said, it was half. Each of them was half true. Who's next? Something more philosophical would be welcome if there was something. Let's go to the back. All right, you want to go back there, George? Okay. He's got the microphone over there. So.
Microphone?
He's got the microphone there.
Hello, thank you. I am Rodrigo from Mexico. I am a student of public policy at CU, and first, just to say that I'm very grateful. It's been a very enriching experience being in this university, in this environment. And I would like to ask you, Plato, another philosopher, had a negative vision of time, or an idea that time had a degenerative effect over things, over reality. On the other hand, the paradigm of modernity presents more of a faith in progress, a conviction that the future will be better than the present. What do you think? Is this a Byzantine discussion, a pointless discussion, or you have an standing point? What's the effect of time over things from your perspective? Thank you.
You know, I'm sorry about not fully understanding the question.
Should I repeat it very briefly?
Yeah?
No.
I mean, my attitude to Plato has been greatly influenced by Karl Popper, although perhaps he's been a little too harsh on Plato.
I think he's asking about progress, whether you believe in progress.
Progress.
I think so.
What do you think?
Yes, certainly I do believe in progress. I definitely think that we can improve our understanding. And certainly, I would argue that, let's say, understanding reflexivity makes dealing with human problems, political problems, much more difficult. And some of our preconceived ideas have to go out of the window. But it is progress, because I think we then understand the difficulties involved in human affairs. And usually misconceptions get particularly wild and far-fetched when you are confronted with insoluble problems. We don't like to tolerate insoluble problems, and therefore we tend to devise false solutions. Again, I come back to death, which is an insoluble problem in the sense it's most likely to occur. And we have then developed all kinds of ways and myths to do away with that prospect. And there are many other, to go from the sublime to the ridiculous, the drug problem. It's an insoluble problem. Drug addiction is innate in human nature. Some people get addicted, and it is a threat to society, and society then deals with it, and the way it deals with it makes it a much worse problem than the drug addiction itself. And the way, for instance, American society has dealt with death has made dying much harder and much more painful, not to mention more expensive, than it need to be. And actually, the two first projects of my foundation in America, one was the project on death in America, and the other one was the drug policy initiative. And I arrived at it from this rather abstract philosophical argument about insoluble problems, and creating remedies which make the problems worse. Does that answer anywhere near your question?
It enlightens me in other issues, but yeah, basically I wanted to ask you, what do you think? Time goes by, right? And time has any kind of effect over things, over a political regime. Plato would say that time has a negative effect, and the effect of time over things turn it degenerative. As opposed to that conception, modernity says that the effect of time over things is positive, and says that future will be better, no? As against to the conception of Plato. What do you think? What's the effect of time, if any, at all, or it's maybe a bit?
I have to interrupt because we're supposed to wind up at this point. I'm told that it's the end of the time and we should do it.
I know today's wonderful 2 hours has only whetted your appetite for the remainder of the week. This has been an extraordinary moment, and I want to thank our audiences here in Budapest at the Hungarian Academy of Sciences and Central European University, and also in London at the London School of Economics, but of course, above all, to thank George Soros for sharing his thoughts, his experience, his philosophy, and launching us on an extraordinary journey that we'll all be going with him. And also to Colin McGinn, so much for, thank you for all you've done to facilitate today. Thank you very much.